So in this video I'd like to go over how you can flash original firmware onto HM-10 clones. Right here I have the HM-10 module. In my case this is actually an original module with the external crystal. However, the firmware version that came with this module is so old that it predates the AT+SBLUP command, which disallows me from being able to normally upgrade the firmware as you would on a regular original HM-10 module. So I had to resort to this method that is normally used with HM-10 clones. I actually removed this module from its breakout board to make things more compact. However, I do not recommend you do this unless you have a hot air station. You don't need to do this yourself. You can absolutely just connect these wires to the module itself while it's on the breakout board. So all we're going to need to do this is an Arduino Uno, 5 cables, and the module itself. We need to connect 3.3 volts and ground from the Arduino over to the VCC and ground pins of the module. Once that's done, we need to connect pin 4 of the Arduino over to the reset pin of the module, which is right beside VCC. And then we need to connect pin 5 and 6 of the Arduino over to pin 7 and 8 on the module respectively. I decided to solder everything in place because my Arduino Uno board is very old and I do not want to trust the quality of these connectors. And so I decided to go with direct solder connections, which are the most reliable. Once you've made all the necessary connections to the module, it is very important to double check your connections and make sure that none of them are bridged together. And so once you have this wired up, we are ready to connect the Arduino Uno to our computer. Now we need to select the appropriate board and port in the Arduino IDE and upload the CC Loader sketch. A link to this will be in the description. So for this part we need Windows so we can run the CC Loader executable. Links to this and the firmware will be in the video description as well. We need to take a look at the COM port that has been assigned to our Arduino Uno. In my case, it's COM4. We need to make sure that both of these are in the same directory. We can now open up a command prompt and cd into the directory of the CC Loader executable and the firmware. Once we're there, we need to enter this command. We need to enter the name of the executable, and then we need to specify the COM port that has been assigned to the Arduino Uno. Then we'll enter the file name of our firmware. And then we need to enter 0, which specifies to the executable that we're using an Arduino Uno. And now we can run this command. And we're done. We have now successfully flashed original firmware onto our HM-10 Bluetooth module. Alright, now that we're done with that part, we can disconnect the module from the Arduino Uno and hook it up to a USB to serial converter. The reason I'm doing this with a USB to serial converter is because it's very easy to switch these converters over to 3.3 volts, which is what we need for the HM-10 Bluetooth module. You can do this with an Arduino Uno, however, you're gonna have to use a voltage divider on the RX pin of the Bluetooth module, because the UART interface on this Bluetooth module is not 5 volt tolerant. The most common way to do this is to place a 2 kilo ohm resistor between ground and the RX pin of the Bluetooth module, and a 1 kilo ohm resistor between the RX pin of the Bluetooth module and the TX pin of the Arduino Uno. You can do that somewhere in your wiring, and that's going to create a voltage divider that will step down the 5 volts coming from the Arduino Uno down to 3.3 volts, which is necessary for this Bluetooth module. Of course, it is far more convenient to use a serial converter that easily allows you to switch over to 3.3 volts when you need it. To wire up this Bluetooth module to the serial converter, we need to connect the power cables, and we need to take the RX of the module to TX of the converter and TX of the module to RX of the serial converter. With all that done, we are now ready to connect this to our computer with a USB cable. With the serial converter connected to our computer, we can open up the Arduino IDE and select the appropriate port. On Windows, this will most likely be a COM port. On Linux, it shows up as USB 0. If you're doing this with an Arduino, you will now need to upload a different sketch, which will be linked in the video description. Once it is selected, we can open up the serial monitor, set it to no line ending at 9600 baud, and we're ready to test out some AT commands. As you can see, it is indeed working just fine. To check the version, we need to enter this command right here. And as you can see, we're now on version 540. This is what we expect to see, however, this firmware version is still really old. The only reason we used it is because it is important to use this specific firmware file to upgrade the HM-10 clones. However, you could potentially experiment around with different firmware versions if you feel like it. From this point on, I cannot guarantee that the steps outlined in this video will work for everyone, because if you have even a slightly different module, it is possible that the following steps might not work well for you. With that out of the way, I would now like to try and upgrade this module to BLE 5.0. Previously, my module was on firmware version 006. That was an extremely old firmware version, I imagine, and it predated the AT+SBLUP command, as I mentioned earlier, which is why I had to use the Arduino Uno and CC loader to upgrade the firmware on my module. However, now that we're on version 540, we should be able to execute this command. Before we do it though, I'd like to mention that once this command has been executed, the module will be rendered unusable until you perform a firmware upgrade. So make sure you don't execute this command when you're not intending to upgrade the firmware on your module. And as we can see, we have received the appropriate response from the board. Now that it's in firmware upgrade mode, I would like to go over the firmware that I'll be using to upgrade it to BLE 5.0. Right here is the manufacturer's website where you can go and download firmware upgrade files for the original HM-10 Bluetooth module. A link to this website will be in the video's description. I'm going to be using this firmware file right here. So this is the point where you're going to have to make a decision. As you can see on the website, there's two different firmware upgrade files available for the HM-10 Bluetooth module. One of them is version 7.10. The other one is the BLE 5.0 version, which is version 650. Here is the changelog files for both of those versions. From my understanding, we have two different update chains that branched off from each other at version 606. As you can see, if you decide to go with the BLE 4.0 firmware, you get to keep all of these updates that are listed in the changelog, all the way from the top over to here. However, if you're not interested with any of these additional features, and it is more important for you to have BLE 5.0, you can go with version 650. That is what I'll be doing in this video because BLE 5.0 is more important to me than all of the features listed here. Once you've downloaded the firmware from the manufacturer's website, you'll get an archive that contains the firmware file, the executable needed to install it, and the changelog, which we just took a look at. As you can see in Device Manager, we're going to need a driver to make the USB to serial converter work in Windows. You can get the driver from this website, which will be linked in the description below. We need the virtual COM port drivers, and the link to download them is right here. Once the drivers have been installed, the USB serial converter should show up like this, and we can check the COM port that has been assigned to the converter. In my case, it's COM5. At this point, we can open up HMSoft.exe, select our COM port, which is 5 in my case. If you're doing this with an Arduino Uno, you'd have to select its COM port instead. Select the image file, and we can now load the image. And we have successfully upgraded the firmware. Back to the serial monitor, we can now check the firmware version. And as you can see, we are on version 651. I was expecting 650, but oh well. We can now also configure the module as needed. Unfortunately, at this point in time, I do not know of a way to actually test whether or not the module is actually using BLE 5.0. So we're just gonna have to trust what the manufacturer says. If you know of a way to verify this, do let me know in the comments. See you in the next one.